Former President Donald Trump was indicted today for trying to overturn his loss to Joe Biden.
We have to win in November, or we're not going to have Pennsylvania. They'll change the name. They're going to change the name of Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvanians have a unique role with democracy and freedom. We have seen Pennsylvanians rise up at the ballot box.
The work of making this world resemble one that you would prefer to live in is a lunch pail job.
Hey, Democrats. Maybe it's time for us to all take a collective deep breath and turn our eyes towards the wisdom and sage words of Mr. Rush Limbaugh. What? Hey, hold on, I'm going somewhere with this. Welcome to the Keystone Reckoning Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse White. It is Friday, April 26, 2024. We are still continuing our breakdown and analysis of this past Tuesday's Democratic primary election. For more broad overview, please check out our last episode. We're now going to start talking about specific races and trends and things of that nature. And today we're going to talk about a trend in the statewide races. That actually were contested. So we're talking about the primaries for Attorney General, Auditor General, and Treasurer. And we're going to look at those. And there's one thread that seems to run through all of them. And it runs along with a piece of conventional wisdom that from a campaign side, we have to talk about as Democrats, because it really played itself out in a very relevant way. Now, I started this episode by saying we should listen to Rush Limbaugh. Okay, obviously, not really, but there is one thing that he said that actually applies here. And by the way, do you know how painful it is to go through a Google search of Rush Limbaugh quotes to find the one you're looking for? Like, it's like, I feel like I have to take 7 showers now going through all his quotes. But the one that is relevant here is Rush Limbaugh said, "I reject conventional wisdom." And I'm sure he was trying to sound smarter than everybody in the room or whatever, but there's something to be taken from that. Because as we went through the Democratic primary, I'm a political consultant. It's one of the hats I wear, doing a lot of different kinds of voter contact with several different kind of companies and organizations. So I was in contact with a lot of consultants, a lot of strategists, and a lot of campaigns going through the primary, working on strategy and voter contact. And the thing that we always kept coming back to that seems to be this conventional wisdom that just does not go away is that you have to win Philadelphia to win a Democratic primary in Pennsylvania. You've got to win Philly. And that is just where everybody sticks. And this primary made it very clear that you don't. You don't need to win Philadelphia to win statewide. And now we have the numbers to prove it. Okay, so let's talk about it for a minute. This idea that winning Philly is the end-all be-all of a Democratic primary, it's quite frankly, it's kind of lazy analysis. And 10, 15, 20 years ago, I could see it a little more because for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you look at the number of voters, in pure population density and everything, obviously Philadelphia is the richest trove of votes per square mile that you're going to find in Pennsylvania, right? The city's overwhelmingly Democratic. It's really a turnout game, right? It's a motivation game. It's a turnout game. Just getting those, like every political campaign since the dawn of time, since, 1776, has said, if we could just get Philly to turn out and vote, we'd be great statewide, right? Every presidential campaign has said that. Every, statewide Senate race has said that. All the state, statewide judicial, statewide row offices. If we could just get Philly to turn out, we'll win. But getting turnout in Philly is very challenging, especially this cycle, because there wasn't really any major Philly-centric races for folks to turn out for. For example, the congressional districts that include Philadelphia, there were no serious primaries there. Dwight Evans had a token opposition, but it was minor, right? He was never in any danger. Those seats were all safe. There were no major state Senate primaries. out there. Things where there would be people on the ground working a field program to get people out to the polls for each side, which would then drive up turnout across the board, or you would have more media spending there, right? You didn't have any of that. And you often don't have that. And it's this weird thing because, in Philly, the primary is the general, right? That is the election in Philly. Now, statewide, it's a much bigger deal. And turnout efforts and the money and the efforts that would need to be spent to turn out Philly in the general are obviously crucially important, right? In a general election, because you need to run up the totals in places like Philly. Well, there's really no place like Philly. You need to run up the total in Philly to offset a lot of the other big red parts of the state. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a Democratic primary. And in a Democratic primary, this time around, it was a low turnout primary across the board, turnout less than 30%. Total Democratic votes cast were 1,015,000. Of those, the votes cast in Philadelphia were 150,000. 14.7% of the Democratic vote came from Philadelphia. Now, granted, that's not nothing, right? 150,000 votes is no joke. If I'm running statewide, I want those votes. Absolutely. But and this is the part we need to look at. There are a couple of factors here. First is when you vote in a primary, your county is next to your name, right? So when people went to vote this time, for example, we'll use Auditor General because it had a Philly. It's the only one, it's one that had a Philly candidate. And so it was Malcolm Kenyatta, Philadelphia, Mark Pinsley, Lehigh. Okay. The general thought there is people vote geography. And I could tell you, being from Western Pennsylvania, I'll be totally honest, from Washington, Allegheny County, all things being equal, you usually weren't going to vote for the candidate from Philly. I would, we all are, we're all kind of parochial in that way, right? We're going to vote for the people that live near us. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's smart, but it's what people do, right? Oh, I live in Washington County. You live in Allegheny County. If I don't know any of the other candidates, and that's the other thing, these were relatively low information races. People didn't know a lot about these candidates. So when they go in to vote, they saw name and county. That's it. So what can you really pull from that? You can figure out where they're from, and from their name, you can probably figure out some ethnicity and gender. Okay, that's it. That's if you take a second and study it. So then from there, people could go and obviously they're like, oh, Philly, much more liberal. You're from Western PA, or Central PA, you're probably more conservative. Again, conventional wisdom, right? We think we know these things, and there might be some of it may be accurate, but it's certainly not all accurate. It's not all, it's nothing you could really say for certain. So there's that part of it. So that's part of it. We have this big chunk of votes in Philadelphia. And I would argue that Philly is unique. It's unique of anywhere in the state for a lot of different reasons, and that's not bad. I want to be clear. I'm a Pittsburgh sports fan, so I usually don't have much good to say about Philly in general. It's one of my least favorite places on the planet to drive, as borne out when we were at a Phillies Pirates game a couple of weeks ago. But from a pure Democratic politics point of view, obviously Philly's critically important in Pennsylvania. And, it offsets a lot of, there's a lot of good that comes out of Philly that offsets a lot of bad going on in other parts of the state. So the key is then being able in a primary to harness those votes. And it's very difficult. And a lot of it has to do with methodology. And if you've never worked on a larger campaign that would encompass, statewide or Philly and other areas, you really don't understand the different strategies that are in play. Okay. So one thing is, we talk about different voter contact methods. And I think that's really what we're coming down to here is how do we talk to voters before an election? And nowadays, I'm a big believer. I've always been a big believer. And you can now, using technology, we can micro-target voters, right? I can use data to know how to get a hold of you. Email, text, phone call. I can knock on your door. I can do all these things. And the technology is really amazing. And we'll talk a lot between now and November about voter contact methods and what works. And I've got a great episode coming up called Mean Texts from this primary that's going to be hilarious. But there's all these different methods. And there's no one way it's one of those things where I can't necessarily tell you the best way, but I could tell you the worst way. And unfortunately, a lot of the worst ways come from Philly in terms of how people try to contact and interact with voters and turn them out, right? There's persuade them to support you, and then there's persuade them to participate, which in a primary, what was going to be a low turnout primary, super important, right? Okay, you've met me, you agree with me, fantastic. How do we get your butt to the polls? It's a two-part process. And when you're talking about statewide, the amount of money it takes to effectively communicate with voters on such a large scale is a huge problem, right? Very few candidates have the kind of money to do that. And almost nobody, the only statewide candidate that's going to have the money to do that on the Democratic side this year is Bob Casey. That's it. That's the list. And obviously President Biden. But a Pennsylvania person running statewide, the only one that'll have enough money to do this truly the right way is Bob Casey. So what are your options, right? You can go up on TV, broadcast TV, cost a fortune, very expensive. In Philly media markets, the most expensive in the state. You can also go up on cable. You can go up on what they call connected TV, which is, ways to get out onto with streaming. Now, I would argue that TV is less effective than ever. It's effective, but now you have people that only watch streaming services, right? You have all the cord cutters. You have all these, it's much more fragmented than it ever used to be. So it's a challenge. Used to be you raised a bunch of money, you went up on TV. Cable, if you had to, broadcast if you could afford it. And that was it, right? For the mass media. But now there are so many different options. So, then you have direct mail. And I did get some direct mail for some statewide this primary. I do direct mail. Direct mail is very expensive. Winning a statewide race with direct mail is very challenging because direct mail, like all advertising, relies on repetition. And it's not cheap. Then you get into digital, right? Which is your seeing it, on streaming, on YouTube, but also social media primarily, Facebook, stuff like that. Can be very effective because now we're getting into the things that can be targeted at cost, right? You could target them in a cost-effective way. You're still not going to hit everybody. But if you've got a good list, you can hit, 60, 70% of your voters that way. And the hits are relatively cheap. Then you get into robocalls and texting. As a disclaimer, one of the things I sell these services to campaigns and candidates. And so that is, something I'm very well versed in. I also work in the AI space, which is another conversation we'll be having. So there's a lot of different ways. But here's my point. In Philly, now you have this other thing, right? So those voter contact methods are like uniform across the board, right? They work pretty much in all time zones. Once you get into Philly, though, there's the ward system, the ward leaders, right? Where the Democratic Party, has their elected ward leaders, and they're powerful there. And obviously this is a throwback to days where machine politics were a lot more effective than they are now. They're nowadays the ability to get to voters in all the ways I just mentioned is very much allows candidates and campaigns and outside groups to go, around that system to get to the voters directly so that they don't need to ask the committee or the ward leaders, who should I vote for? And also, the days of patronage are gone, right? So it's not like it used to be. But what they will do in Philly, and I've had to do this in places in the past, in Allegheny County and places like that. It happened and still happens, but the phrase street money comes into the street money has entered the chat, okay? Which means the campaign is asked to give cash to whoever, the ward leaders, whoever it's going to be, to then distribute to people to stand at the polls and hand out literature or do whatever. And campaigns this time around felt a lot of pressure to invest in, they could say in a turnout program or whatever, but basically it was give us cash and we will get you votes. That's what it is. And I personally, to me, I think you might be more effective taking your money, putting it in a pile, lighting it on fire, and offering people a nice, to be able to sit by the fire and warm their hands as a way to get their vote as a more effective method. This is, by the way, coming from what I've seen, and this isn't just a Philly thing. I want to be clear. This is not Philly centric. But when you give money for people to be at the polls, unless they are someone who knows everybody there, those people are few and far between. And they're usually the kind of people that are going to do it for free because they want to volunteer. But if you're paying someone to be there, they're either going to show up and just eat and sit and talk and not talk to voters, or they're going to just basically hand stuff to people that people don't want. And the other thing is, we are now in a position where Democratic voters especially don't even go to the polls anymore because we all vote by mail. So like 40% of the voters that you need to get aren't even showing up at the polls because they've already voted. It's a very ineffective, maybe one of the most ineffective methods of spending your campaign resources that you could possibly imagine in terms of voter contact. There are a lot of other bad ways. There's some, we're going to tell some stories out of campaign finance reports this time around. But so how do you get Philly? And, we fall into this conventional wisdom. I'm a candidate. I've got someone telling me that I need to put this money into Philly. Spoiler alert, it's someone from Philly, right? Wouldn't be shocked if there's a finder's fee involved. We've all got to make money. And, but you're literally just pouring money into a bucket and hoping that you get something out of it. There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to quantify what you get from that. Whereas if I'm emailing, calling, texting, knocking, I have data coming back, right? Or at least I know the message is delivered to the voter. So, but that's Philly, right? And we always fall into this trap of we've got to, somehow Philly's different. And what this election taught us was that the two truly contested races, Attorney General and Treasurer, the candidate that won Philadelphia lost the election. I'm going to repeat that. The candidate who won Philadelphia lost the election. So, and remember that anytime somebody is telling you this is how it is, you have to win Philly, you have to win Philly. No, you really don't. And I would argue that if you're not from Philly, even if you are from Philly, right, you would take those votes, bank them, and go everywhere else. If you're not from Philly and you're running against someone from Philly, acknowledge they're going to, I had a situation this time where a candidate was being asked to put money in, like multiple candidates were being asked to put money into a Philly field election day program. And my question to the candidate was, wait a minute, if they're taking your money and they're taking your opponent's money, what good does that do? And they were like, well, we just want to cancel out. What? You've basically just given the people you're giving the money to an out to not deliver at all because you're asking that you're basically saying, here, I'm going to give you money to offset their money to make sure you don't do anything for them? What? Makes no sense. And there are campaigns, and we will talk about it when the reports come out, that large percentages of their voter contact budget went to stuff like that instead of actual voter contact that was quantifiable and qualitative and that it was high quality. And they could have talked to a hell of a lot more voters a lot more effectively for a lot less money, and they didn't, and the results will bear that out. So let's look very quickly at these couple of contests and to give you an idea. So let's start with the Attorney General. The statewide winner was Eugene DePasquale, who had geography on his side. He lives in Allegheny County now. He's from there. He's from Pittsburgh originally, but he was a state rep from York County for a lot of years. I was in there with him. So that's where his political history's from. And then as a two-term auditor general, he was well known, obviously, in the other part of central PA because this is a company town, and everybody just knew who he was. So he didn't need Philly. And if you look at the heat map of where he won basically won everything but Philly, right? He won everything west of Harrisburg, and he won it handily. Okay, so let's look at his overall. He got 368,000 votes, which was 35% of the vote in a 5-candidate field. Okay. So he came in first. In Philly, sorry, I have to click it. In Philly, that's Montgomery County is not Philly. In Philly, DePasquale got 8.3% of the vote. He got 13,500 out of 150,000. He did the worst by almost half. The next highest performing candidate was Joe Kahn with 15%. So he almost the fourth place candidate pretty much doubled the fifth place candidate. Okay. Di Pasquale gets crushed in Philadelphia, wins handily everywhere else, wins the primary. Now, the inverse of that, Kiera Bradford Gray, Philadelphia. She was a Philadelphia public defender, only woman in the race, only person of color in the race. Okay. There should have been a statewide appeal there to Democratic primary voters who want to vote for women. And these were all 5 qualified candidates. This is a great race to look at because all 5 candidates are qualified. So you can't look at one and be like, yeah, but they were a bad candidate or whatever. Like, they all had their strengths. And I think that had something to do with there not being an endorsement in the race. I think people recognize that. So Kiera Bradford Gray wins Philly handily, 36%. Basically the same amount that Di Pasquale wins the state by. She wins Philly with 36%, 57, almost 58,000 votes. The next closest was Jared Solomon with only 22% of the vote. She beat him by over 22,000 votes in Philly, right? So she won Philly handily, right? So she is clearly, she's running for mayor at some point or running for city council or whatever. I mean, she did very well. And especially because the other 3 candidates, Joe Kahn, Jack Stallmeyer, and Jared Solomon, all are they're fall Philly adjacent. They're all Eastern PA, right? So, she did very well. Now, 36% in Philly. How did she do statewide? Well, you ask, she got 15% of the vote statewide. She came in second to last. She got over a third of her votes statewide out of Philly, right? She disproportionately won Philly. And she came in 4th out of 5. And she was only avoided last place by about 2 points. So she didn't need Philly to win. And and we'll look at the reports, if she did put money into Philly, that's insane. Because she just didn't need it, right? And she clearly did it everywhere else. She had a great profile, could have done a lot better in a lot of places, didn't happen. All right, let's look briefly then at treasurer, the other one. I want to skip auditor general for a massive amount of reasons, mainly because it was not a competitive race as the numbers bear out. Malcolm Kenyatta was from Philly. He won, to give you an idea, he won 65% of the vote statewide. In Philly, he won 89% of the vote. But it didn't matter. The Pinsley campaign didn't do enough outside of Philly to even put a dent into that. I think that the campaign finance reports will show that they probably should have. All right, let's talk treasurer for a second. And this will be the last one. Okay, this is a great example. Ryan Bizzarro, Democratic endorsed statewide. We've talked about this. He had all the endorsements, whatever. He wins Philadelphia handily, 62% to 38% over Aaron McClellan. He has 86,000, almost 87,000 votes to her 54,000. So he almost doesn't quite, but he's didn't double her up, but he 1.5 her up in Philly, right? And by the way, this is a good test because he's from Erie, Bizzarro's from Erie, McClellan's from Allegheny County. So there was nobody west of Venango. There's nobody east of Venango on the ballot, right? That was it. This was a Western PA thing. So Philly was fertile ground for everybody. Okay. Bizzarro does great there, almost 62%. But what did he do statewide? He loses. He has not even 46% of the vote. He loses McClellan 54 to 48. So in a race where there was no Philly candidate, and we'll see, we know he was up on TV, and I'm curious to see where. But if he did it, so yes, he won Philly, but did he overspend in Philly at the expense of other places? I don't know. We're going to find out. I'd be willing to bet that he did. I would be, and I know I looked at some, Bizzarro outraised McClellan, I think 5-1. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood. So he had the money comparatively. And I know what McClellan did for some voter contact. It's been out there, and full disclosure, was involved in some of the outreach that she did. I'm not part of the campaign. I want to be clear about that, but we did some vendor work for her race late. So I know what they did and didn't do. So I'm speaking from some serious knowledge here. I know exactly what was said and who it was said to, at least part of it. And it clearly, the strategy, and I'm not considering to say it was all mine, but I contributed to it, that part of it, that strategy worked. So the point is there's the show Heroes. I never really watched it, but I was like, I knew it, right? But if you remember that show Heroes, for a while, there was that phrase, save the cheerleader, save the world, right? I don't know what it means, but I know everybody was saying it. And it just, whenever I was thinking about all this conventional wisdom stuff, it's like, win Philly, win the state. Win Philly, win the nomination. No, that's just not accurate. I'm not saying it's never accurate. There are times where that can very easily be a very smart strategy for a campaign to take. But campaigns are not monolithic. Philadelphia is not monolithic. I think that's actually pretty offensive to suggest that Philly is this monolithic. It's a massive city, county with an incredible amount of diversity, racial, ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic. I mean, it is maybe the least monolithic voting bloc in the state. And I think it's done a disservice that people in the candidate world and the consultant world just treat it like it's just this big blue bucket, and it's not. But to assume that is the beginning and the end of an election statewide is just not accurate. And now we have the numbers to prove it. There's a lot more of these results are going to tell us, but that was the thing when I looked at these on election night and the next day, that was the first thing I went to because I'd been hearing about it. I've been hearing, you hear about it every year, but this year especially, everybody's strategy was built around Philly, and the cost and the uncertainty of voter contact to Philly voters as compared to the ways you could talk to voters all over the state, and the fact that Philly will generally vote for Philly, other areas will tend to not vote for Philly, and those are kind of burned in biases, geographical biases that are hard to overcome, not impossible, but they're hard to. But why go against the grain when you don't have to? So there are huge lessons to be taken from these races that need to become part of the conversation in lieu of or in replacement of the conventional wisdom. Because the people that look at this and actually understand it will be able to take this information and use it next time to actually be successful. Because they'll actually know what works and what doesn't work, or they'll know what doesn't work. And that's what we need to be doing, because learning how to do these things smartly in the primary is how we can do them successfully in the general. Obviously not just about Philly, but about voting strategies in general. And that's how we win elections. And that's how we beat the Republicans. And we do it by being smart. And we do it by having a combination of good analytics, not just getting the numbers, but knowing what they mean and what they don't mean. And then using that with good messaging that will move votes in those areas where we can move them. That's what we need to do, because we have our work cut out for us in November. And we've got to be smart, and we've got to get past conventional wisdom, because if you look at where it's gotten us way too close for comfort, and there's too much at stake. Thank you for taking the time to join me. This has been the Keystone Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse White. Let's do it again next week as the deep dive continues. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Well, that's it then. And we've saved people the trouble of voting. What's next?
Our point is that it's...
I understood the point. We're going to South Carolina to set up Illinois. When I ask what's next, it means I'm ready to move on to other things. So, what's next?
We're done.
Fantastic.